Imagine being a woman impregnated out of wedlock and people around you, your culture perceives this child as a curse, or in Filipino, sumpa. And immediately after you gave birth, this child is taken from you to perish in the river. This is actually a true story by the Omi tribe in Africa. And thank goodness many have stopped this practice. And today we would explore one of the disease causality in the Filipino culture called Sumpa, the curse, why it's important to understand this in encouraging Filipinos in seeking physical and mental health support services. Stick around. Are Filipinos truly bilingual? We use the same language at home but speak in love languages foreign to each other, together but separated. Kamusta? I'm Rowan, licensed psychotherapist mom, immigrant twice, first generation Pinoy raising my mixed Filipino-American children in America. I found that after visiting 500 Filipino homes, I continue to be a student of the culture. In this podcast, we would be seatmates in this beautiful cultural classroom. And by the way, did I tell you I need my kapeng barako straight from Batangas before each class? If you're interested in learning the deep intricacies of the Filipino culture, especially as it merged with American culture, talks about trauma-informed care, and deepening your Filipino relationships across generations, which includes my fave topic, Pinoy love languages, you're in the right place. By the way, if you haven't dropped a 5-star review, pause and do that. It helps other people find this podcast. And it's an important message to teach the common language we Filipinos need to unlearn and relearn, aka in my world, Pinoy love languages. Also, if you're enjoying the content of this podcast, check the free webinar on Speak the Pinoy Love Language. There I share the reason why we have this cultural gap in our Filipino homes and why it has existed for decades and how you can begin to transform your Filipino relationships today. Go in the show notes for more details. Kamusta everyone? Welcome to the Pinoy Love Language podcast. This is your host, Rowan. I am so grateful that whatever you're doing, whether you're doing the laundry, driving. I usually am cooking when I'm listening to other podcasts, but that you have me in your ears, I'm very grateful. So today, let's talk about Sumpa. If you haven't listened to the prior episode where I talk about lihe, come visit that after you listen to this episode. That's the first disease causality episode that we're doing. So Sumpa in Gaba. Okay, these are two different concepts but under the same umbrella. They are curses. So first, Sumpa is a curse inflicted by another human being, and Gaba is believed to be inflicted by the gods or God, the God. So in many ways, we jumble these two concepts together, and sumpa is the curse is more often used even in the motherland. So let me give you an example first of sumpa. So I am reading off this example from the Journal of Cultural Beliefs on Disease Causation in the Philippines, Challenge and Implications in Genetic Counseling by James Abad et al. With his other friends. That's what that means. So the first case is of a 12-year-old girl, and the 12-year-old girl is noted to have no hair, senile in appearance, and the mother shared that these features started when this kid was only 5 years old. So when they were doing the genetic counseling, she was diagnosed with progeria, which is, a feature when someone has almost a feature of someone, an older person. So this is an example of sumpa. So this child seemingly is not perceived to be normal. And then bad luck, or so as life happens, things do not go as the father have envisioned. And because there is this precursor of having a child, quote and unquote, as not being normal, the father saw this child as the curse of the family. And if you see someone as a curse, it's almost like without enough information, you want to get rid of this sumpa, this curse. And in the approach of the father, he started beating up this child without knowing that there is actually an explanation. Well, the child has no hair and has senile appearance because of the diagnosis of progeria. And so in this case, though, you might be comforted that the mother actually fled the scene so that the child could be free from the father's beatings. So that's the first one I am going to summarize after we talk about Gaba. So here's another scenario. So remember that Gaba is slightly different in that is seen as inflicted by the gods, right? So here you go. There's a 33-year-old married woman who sought consult at the cancer genetics clinic due to changes in her bowel movement, and suddenly she had weight loss. So she was diagnosed with cancer, and her family history is significant for multiple members with previous diagnosis of cancer, different kinds of cancer. And with resignation, the patient shared during the clinic visit that the cancer in their family are due to Gaba, meaning it is inflicted by the gods or it's given by the gods. So it's almost like a curse by the god that someone may have done something bad within the family tree. If you have a vision of like a genogram, so maybe it's the great father, grandfather who did something, and now the punishment is trickled down to his other family members, those that came after him. Now, why this is important to understand and how this looks like in the modern world and in America, especially because most of our listeners are in America, in Canada. We even have listeners from Greece and Taiwan. Shout out to you guys. Thanks for taking a listen. To tell you the truth, many times we may no longer have the language to say, oh, I'm feeling this way towards this other person, or I understand you why you don't want to seek help. It's because of the sense of sumpa or concept in the culture, especially in the Western world. These things, these language, these concepts seemingly have been watered down. But I'm sharing it here today because even though we might not have the language, the concept of curse, that concept, what it means to us, how we see things, might still be there. There are two concepts about sumpa that I want you to lean into more. First is that when someone is a sumpa, you want to blame them. You want to make their life hard for causing you such hardship, right? Just as the case of the father who was beating the child because she doesn't look normal and perhaps something have occurred after her birth that the father has perceived to be bad news. Second, when you think that you have been inflicted by some bad news from the gods, a sickness or an ailment, the tendency is to suffer through it. If you've been punished, there's a belief that you have done something or someone who represents you have done something. And so, my goodness, if you would not accept it or much more complain about it, what does this say about you? So these things are very important to understand, especially for people who are trying to encourage people towards accepting some type of mental health or physical help. So it could be therapy or talking to the doctor, seeking some type of treatment. So we have this concept of black sheep being the bad news in the family. And usually there's blaming there. In our language, Freudian language, it's the identified patient. So sometimes family knocks in our mental health doors and asks, could you fix this person, right? The identified patient in the family. Most of the time, the identified patient is the one that simply is acting out the symptoms, not of just their own space, but the symptoms of the family in its entirety. And it would be easier for the family to identify that person as the bad apple. So please remove that bad apple or fix that bad apple so we could get on with our life is usually the mantra. And so, who is blame in your family? I'm curious. And is there a black sheep in your family? We will continue with our conversation. Please stick around. Diyan ka lang. I want to know what topics interest you about Filipino relationship, immigration, mental health, at iba pa. Send me a message at info@calamansijuice.com with the subject title podcast topic. And as always, the email will be in the show notes. I'll see you there. Welcome back, and I'm glad you're still here. So, we stopped where we were talking about the first part of Sumpa, which is blaming, right? So, it's easier to blame the bad apple. It's easier to have the identified patient, go fix that person so that we could just go on with our lives, if you will. The second part is this belief that you have been punished, right? That there is someone in your family tree that has maybe committed a crime, and now it's your turn to make amends. So to actually be able to repay is not to complain about it. So if you could imagine in the example of someone having a cancer, right? If you think you are actually making amends by paying off some type of debt to the gods through living with your cancer, the question is, how would you navigate your treatment, right? Most of the time, the answer is to not navigate it, to suffer in silence, because that is what makes sense. Now, as you're listening to this, you're thinking that doesn't even make sense. The truth is, reality and truth is relative to the person. And we're always looking for reasoning why things happen in a certain way. And if you listen to the episode prior to this, episode 13, I talk about the foundation of disease causality, which is when we don't have enough information, not enough science, we're always anchoring in stories so that we're filling in the gaps. And even though it might not sound like a reasonable story for another person, it makes sense to the holder of that story. And that truly is what matters to that person. And if you're in a position while listening to this episode to encourage someone, to motivate someone, it's really important that you understand their story from a place of compassion. And it's easy for us to say, no, 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 don't go that way, don't feel that way. But imagine how encouraging you can be if you understood first their story. And that takes deep listening, a listening where you would have to put your own agenda at a pause and where you are actually not wearing your own lens, but rather looking through someone's lens in as much as you can. That fully stepping into someone's shoes is not 100%. We all attempt. As a clinician, I attempt to do that. But while I attempt, I know that I could not fully be in someone else's shoes. And just with that, by knowing that you can't fully, builds our own compassion for the other person. And so it's important to understand this. Now, in our modern times, how do we work around these beliefs? Again, I am going to be referencing that journal on cultural beliefs by Abad and his friends. So, to be culturally sensitive and competent, according to this journal. The counselor must be able to trust and build trust and rapport with the client. There's a study on Mexican women that dealt with cultural health practices during pregnancy, and it revealed that women have never disclosed any of their pregnancy related cultural health experience to their health provider because they're afraid that their care provider might be dismissive and judgmental of their beliefs. So, especially in the Filipino culture, we really are watching the provider's cues. And many times we want to please the provider. And sometimes that's why, with questionnaires we give to patients, sometimes from providers, I know that not all, but some immigrants are already thinking what the response would look like and sound like. So they're very, really conscious about how they will be perceived. And it's important to create a safe space first before we start asking our rudimentary questions. So, similarly, in a study in Taiwan, parents of children with autism were open to discuss their beliefs in the supernatural etiology of their children's condition after having a trusting relationship with the researchers, right? This is by a study by Shuyu et al. In 2010. These highlight the need for health providers who are open minded, non judgmental, and really are halting their judgment and really understanding that even though we as providers are an expert in what we do, truly the client, the patient, is the expert in their own space. So before I close, I want to thank you for being here. Again, all the details are in the show notes, the free webinar, and share this podcast with a friend. I would truly appreciate that. And thank you for being here. In summary, whether your elders consciously acknowledge it or not, we know that this concept is still very much alive by the concept of when we blame someone for a misfortune that happens to us, when we suffer in silence. There's something about suffering in silence that makes sense to that person's story. The only way we can pivot from that story is from understanding where the story originally came from to begin with and what it does for that person. So listen intently. And if you need mental health professional service, seek a culturally relevant, sensitive professional. And I thank you for hanging out with me. Check out the next coming episodes. And if you haven't listened to the episodes before, episode 14, go take a listen now. And don't forget to leave a stellar review. Maraming salamat. I'll be signing off now. Again, this is Rowan. Sa uulitin.